Sean todos ustedes bienvenidos y
Welcome to all of you. Welcome to this transmission that will present the results of the regional report on monitoring of Sustainable Development Goal number 4 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, called The Crossroads of Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd like to comment that this ceremony, we're transmitting it, broadcasting it jointly with the three organizations, UNESCO, UNICEF, and ECLAC, all three entities. We also have a broadcast in English for those of you that need this, and I would like to greet everyone that will accompany us today. We have Claudia Uribe with us, a director of the regional office and the representative of UNESCO in Chile. Alberto Arenas de Mesa, Director of the Social Development Division of ECLAC. Rada Nueva, Adjunct Regional Director, COO of OIC for UNICEF for Latin America and the Caribbean. We have Daniela Truco with us, who is the Superior Official of Social Affairs from ECLAC. We have Alejandro Vera, who is the head of the monitoring unit and monitoring and planning unit of education, Real UNESCO Santiago. Italo Dutra, Regional Advisor for
Mercedes Mateo,
UNICEF Lacro. Mercedes Mateo, head of the Education Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Lorette Bristol, Program Manager, Human Research Development at CARICOM. And we have Leonardo Garnier, the Special Advisor of the Secretary General of the UN for the Summit on the Transformation of Education. To all the panel members, I'd like to greet, and everyone that's following this broadcast, would like to cordially welcome. Today, we will have the opportunity of getting to know about the progress of the implementation of SDG4 in the region, and we'll be able to know about your opinions, your comments from different experts regarding this report. Before we go into our topic today, we will go with a bit of context. 7 years ago, the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, approved the 2030 Agenda, whose aims, in its aims, we have the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. SDG4 set a series of challenges for the fulfillment of educational goals, and it defined providing an inclusive, equitable vision and quality vision for education in the based on the regional monitoring report SDG4 Education 2030 that UNESCO, UNICEF, and ECLAC will publish today. We will conduct a balance of its full implementation in Latin America and the Caribbean, the implementation of this ambitious objective and its commitment. This launch event will be structured as follows. In the first place, we will have some introduction and opening words from the authorities of the three organizations who are co-authored to this publication. Then we will have the presentation of the regional report. Subsequently, we will hear the opinions and comments from all the lecturers. And to conclude, we will have a couple of closing words. We will therefore initiate with this encounter with the presentation of an expert. Come on. the Caribbean. What did you think? Interesting video, huh? Before initiating or to open this meeting, I'd like to leave you with Claudia Uribe, who is the director of the regional office and representative of UNESCO in Chile. Welcome, Claudia. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It is a true joy for me to open this launch event, the launch of the publication, The Crossroads of Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, Regional Monitoring Report of SDG 4, Education 2030. This publication is a joint effort of three funds and agencies of the UN system in our region, the Regional Office for Education of OREAL, UNESCO, and the Regional Office of UNICEF, and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. In turn, the work of our teams of professionals has reaped the benefits of the support of many other institutions, such as the International Institute of UNESCO for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, the ESALC, and along with a group of specialists and experts who, from different roles, have participated in its creation, contributing with their knowledge and their experience. Now, the publication gives a view of the education of Agenda 2030 of Sustainable Development in 2015. Now, specifically, the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which seeks to ensure inclusive, equitable, and quality education for everyone. The report analyzes the achievements and identifies the challenges that may help make decisions on educational policies in the next decades to come, and thus promote the fulfillment of the objectives proposed by 2030. This balance is of utmost importance in the context the region is in educational terms, as the different stakeholders of the sector have alerted or warned the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean face the greatest educational crisis of the last years, right? Structural debts of the educational systems deepened with the arrival of COVID-19. More than 170 million students and their families were affected. The estimations available account for a scenario which is quite alarming: losses, learnings, and its impact, which has been especially severe in the most vulnerable populations, thus increasing inequalities, which we drag now for many years, right? We're dragging. Now, the derived impacts of the pandemic, they're still here, and they demand coordinated and immediate actions to rescue the present and future of children and the youth here in the region. Within this context, the regional monitoring report, which we will present today, is a rich resource which will allow us to identify and to see the educational trends prior to the crisis, to analyze them, to understand how countries faced the challenges imposed by the pandemic, and we'll be able to assess the conditions required for the demands of the next years to come. The education in Latin America and the Caribbean faces a crossroad, which is decisive. The road to the SDG4 goals is still a long road, right? And it's quite uncertain, increasingly more uncertain and unpredictable. The report shows that educational systems of the region, they face old and new tensions, right? And it's objective to ensure the right to education throughout life for everyone. And in its main conclusions, we can highlight that the fulfillment of the SDGs fulfilled for 2030 was not ensured or guaranteed even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And they're not, it's present, the region is currently living the challenging present. How evidence them goals, we won't be able to reach them and modify the path and the assignment of more resources for education. in the Buenos Aires 2022 declaration or statement created within the framework of the third regional meeting of ministers of education of Latin America and the Caribbean, our educational authorities of the region recognize that these challenges are shared by most of Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, and assumed the commitments and the need of driving deep something that covers the systemic factors that have contributed to the historical debt and the educational injustice that the region is dragging. Now, this summit on the transformation of education, which will be held on September the 19th of 2022 in New York, establishes a global space for continuity to conduct a balance of the efforts made to recover the loss in learning, right, related with the pandemic, and also to reimagine the educational systems for the world of today and tomorrow, and to revitalize our national and global efforts to reach SDG4. The next years to come will be decisive. We need to look for exits now to the crossroads of education, and this will
diálogos que articulen los esfuerzos de múltiples actores y el uso de la evidencia comparada. Será clave combinar una mirada realista con una transformadora también a la vez. No es suficiente continuar en el mismo rumbo. Son necesarios cambios profundos para alcanzar las metas en 2030. Quisiera concluir estas palabras haciendo un sincero agradecimiento a todos y todas las profesionales que han dedicado esfuerzo y trabajo a la elaboración de esta publicación. Gracias a su compromiso y dedicación, hoy presentamos este primer informe que esperamos constituya un valioso insumo al debate educativo en nuestra región. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Claudia Uribe, por esta interesante información que nos entregas. Y ahora es el turno de entregar la palabra a Alberto Arenas de Mesa. Él es el director de la División de Desarrollo Social de la CEPAL. Bienvenido, Alberto. Adelante, lo escuchamos.
Muchas gracias y muy buenos días a todas y todos. Un saludo especial a la señora Claudia Uribe, directora de la Oficina Regional y representante de la UNESCO en Chile, y a Rada Nueva, directora regional adjunta de la UNICEF para América Latina y el Caribe. Muchas gracias por invitarnos a ser parte de esta iniciativa conjunta de Naciones Unidas para el monitoreo del ODS 4 de la Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible. Y un saludo muy especial para el equipo que coordinó la preparación de este documento: Alejandro Vera, jefe de la sección de monitoreo y planificación, Orial UNESCO Santiago, Ítalo Dutra, asesor regional de educación UNICEF Flacro, y a Daniela Trucu, oficial superior de Asuntos Sociales de la División de Desarrollo Social de la CEPAL. Y quiero también saludar especialmente a los connotados comentaristas que nos acompañan hoy: Mercedes Mateo, jefa de la División de Educación del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo; Lorette Bristol, Program Manager, Human Resource Development and CARICOM; y a Leonardo Garnier, asesor especial del Secretario General de las Naciones Unidas para la Cumbre sobre la Transformación de la Educación. Algo que todas y todos compartimos y que hay que repetir con intensidad en esta crisis social prolongada que vive la región, es que toda estrategia exitosa de desarrollo sostenible debe colocar en el centro la educación. La educación es clave para el desarrollo económico y social inclusivo de los países y cumple un rol propulsor del logro de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible acordados para el 2030. La educación está estrechamente asociada con las oportunidades para acceder a mejores condiciones sociales,
better social conditions, economic
culturales.
cultural intensity, and the extension of the social crisis that we've lived in these last days, the last years. The pandemic of COVID-19 has left evidence of different of that in terms of quality of the educational systems in Latin America and their Caribbean. which we've been dragging the region progress towards the Sustainable Development Goal, which is reflected in the document and will be described by the presentation of our colleagues, their presentations with the regional report. We need to actively invest in education, especially on an investment path that is different from the one of the region. Or we won't be able to drive the educational recovery we need when the region has implemented efforts to expand the spend and invest. Against this positive trend, the public spend of education showed signs of stagnation before the pandemic, and its spend was able to reach the SDGs. Now it's critical for countries to prioritize educational funding with essential elements and efforts to have transformation for quality and sustainability in the region. Now, for this purpose, we need political agreements that lead to social pacts that are accompanied first to have new political agreements, right, that make sure we have the financial stability and we have the impact of the social crisis. The implications, they are an opportunity for countries to strengthen the role of education as a central mechanism for economic inequality and to recognize the importance to recover inclusive social development, to recover the path, right, and sustainable education. To invest in education is to invest in people, which are the most important asset of countries. So that has to be a priority in order not to leave anyone behind and to advance unsustainable development with equality. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alberto, for these interesting words. And to conclude this first stage, it is now the turn of Rada Noeda. Rada is the Regional Director of UNICEF for Latin America, Director for Latin America and the Caribbean. So please, the floor is yours, Rada. The floor is yours, Rada.
Por favor, si puedes desmutear tu
Rada, if you could unmute yourself, please, just to hear you.
Está abierto. Ahora
It's
sí.
open now, I see.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Y perdona, estaba diciendo que...
Sorry, I was saying that it is an enormous pleasure to be here on behalf of UNICEF and on behalf of the team, part of development of this analysis, the launch of the report. Will be part of the contribution that we want to offer to the governments of the region. For commissioning the follow-up of the recommendations. As we very well know, and as you mentioned, the pandemic is creating a regional event that is historical, right? Years of low growth, increase of poverty, and growing social tensions. As well, it deepened the structural inequalities with high levels of informality and lack of social protection, uncovering critical issues in health education and care. Now, due to the pandemic, the region went through the most important crisis, right? And this last being the region of the world with the worst economic and financial crisis, was the fall of the GDP of 6.8% and shy recovery 6.2% in 2021 of the GDP, which was insufficient to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. Now, today, the effects of the pandemic on educational systems are not known, are not fully known. Nevertheless, the challenges that we will face in the region, finalization specifically in primary school, the ongoing exclusion of the educational system suffered by children and the youth, the most vulnerable children, such as children with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and those in extreme poverty, And the crisis evidenced by regional studies will be an international one. Now, the Declaration of Buenos Aires of 2022 shows the importance and the acknowledgement of the educational ministers of the region. They've acknowledged the need of a profound, deep transformation of the educational system that provide an answer to the depths of injustice that exist in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the report that we will launch is an analysis of the main traditional topics of the region: access to equity, finishing rates of the different educational trenches, the different educational subsystems, and the situation of people, among others. In addition, we have a perspective on the main educational indicators of the region, the policies implemented. But we're also going to address the most important challenges of achievement of the SDGs by 2030. Now, the recovery of education demands reform and emergency, yet decided immediate action with all sectors on board to make sure that the youth and the children have an access to quality education. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Rada.
Thank you very much, Rada. We'd like to thank you for your participation. Rada, I'd like to remind you that she is here from UNICEF. And I'd also like to thank Alberto Arena de Mesas from UCLAC and Claudia from UNESCO, who provided the opening words in the encounter for the regional monitoring report of the SDG number 4, Education 2030. Now, we would like to invite you to hear the presentation of the regional report that we're here for, right? This presentation also has an English version for those of you that want to speak in English. We have interpretation. So, to conduct this balance and look at the projection of the forecast in order to ensure the objectives, Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, SDG 4, approved by the UN in 2015, I'd like to invite Daniela Truco, who is the High Official of Social Affairs of ICLAC, Alejandro Vera, who is Head of the Monitoring and Planning Section, Oral UNESCO Santiago, and Mr. Dutra, the Regional Advisor of Education, UNICEF Lacro. Welcome, everyone, and we are going to hear our first lecture here for this second block or panel. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much. And a special greeting for all the authorities that spoke before me. And now we will start with the presentation of this document, which you'll be able to find online. It's the full report with all this interesting information, right? I'd like to tell you to please share my presentation so I can share. In this document, we analyze the achievements, we identify challenges to focus decision-making of education and policies in the next centuries or decade, really, and to promote the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Now, next slide, please. Next one, please. The first thing I'd like to share with you is that the context and the social trends of the region. I'd like to share the economic and social aspects. These are critical to understand the needs and obstacles faced by the educational systems. The pandemic has gone deep into the structural problems of inequality, poverty, and informality in this social crisis, which is prolonged. Now, the pandemic, in addition, broke out in a specific scenario, right, with 7 years of low growth in the region, with the brief increase of poverty, and there were growing social tensions. It went deep into structural inequalities with high levels of informality and lack of social protection, as mentioned by Rada. in the opening ceremony, right? Leaving and showing critical knots in terms or gaps in health, education, and care this year in 2022. To this, we will add the consequences of the war in Ukraine and inflationary pressures in many of our countries. Now, the extended social crisis, which has extended for more than 2 years, imposes new challenges to countries to ensure the fulfillment of SDG4 and to sustain the achievements of the last decades in education, which we will see in the presentation of this report. But I would like to mention that we need coordinated, integrated efforts to other dimensions of development to be able to bridge the gaps in the educational sector. Now, due to the 2020 pandemic, the region went through the largest crisis in the last century with a fall of the GDP of 6.8% and the worst economic and financial performance in all the regions across the world. The growth trend in Latin America and the Caribbean was slowing down prior to the crisis. Between 2014 and 2019, the region grew at an average rate of 0.3%, accounting for one of the worst growth periods ever, with similar levels to those of World War I and the Great Depression. The economic recovery in 2021 with 6.5% of the GDP has not been enough to mitigate the social and labor effects of the pandemic. In addition, ECLAC projects an average growth of 2.7% in the region for this year, 2022. Going back to the low numbers that the region was in prior to the pandemic. Next one, please. 2030 Agenda proposes the eradication of poverty in all its forms, as one of its main goals globally and with a requirement to progress on sustainable development. Between 2022 and 2014, poverty and extreme poverty really reduced in the region. Nevertheless, that trend started to reverse since 2015, where both poverty and extreme poverty showed small increases. Now, in 2020, they increased for 6 consecutive years, poverty and extreme poverty. In 2021, despite the economic recovery, we have a delay of 27 years in the increase of extreme poverty, reaching or accounting for 13.8% of the population in America, which accounts for 86 million people, approx. Next one, please. In addition, inequality increased between 2019 and 2020, as you can see in this graph, due to the variation of the Gini coefficient. This broke a trend of the reduction of inequality, which was in the region since 2002. Now the deterioration of this distributed situation in 2020 is linked to the consequences of COVID-19. Though the factor that was important here was the reduction of labor income and of wages and the quintiles and the poorer quintiles society. Next one, please. The fiscal policy and the social expenditure were key to respond to the crisis caused by the COVID pandemic during 2020. The fiscal measure packages implemented by countries in the region during that year accounted for 0.6% of the GDP, which were destined to strengthen the public health systems to support with monetary transfers the entry of the income of family. And between 2015 and 2019, the social public spend, the average one during in the central government in 17 countries of Latin America. Please go back to the prior slide. And 5 countries of the Caribbean was stable regarding the GDP. Now, the social expenditure of the central government reached its historical maximum in 2020, reaching 13.3% of the GDP in the Caribbean and 13 something in Latin America, consolidating as a main component of public expenditure. The challenge is to maintain sustainable expenditure levels that are to hamper the increase of this crisis. This is important for the transformation that we need in education. And later on, Alejandra will she'll show the trends of the region in investment of education in this period. Next one, please.
In
Latin America, the interruption of the schooling in person was big, and digital media played a key role for the continuity and for the efforts of educational continuity that were performed in countries. Nonetheless, we see on the graph on the left that less than half of the primary schools had connectivity prior to the pandemic, and only 67% of secondary schools. And these percentages had not progressed in the past years. In the graph on the right, we can see that also prior to the pandemic, countries that had information about this showed only 33% of children and adolescents between 5 and 20 years lived in households without internet access, and the access was very unequal in countries throughout the region. According to this graph, 47% of this population over the first quintile did not have access. Education with digital means is something that is here to stay. Digital revolution has impacted different aspects at a speed that has never been seen before, and something that was exacerbated in the pandemic. So this is essential not just to have the connectivity and proper equipment but also with having the necessary digital skills becomes a priority. With that, I give the floor to Alejandro so that he can show the main trends that were analyzed in 2021.
Muchas gracias, Daniela, por tu presentación, y efectivamente.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for your presentation. And as you well put it, we'll now listen from Mr. Vera, head of the section of monitoring and planning, Boreal UNESCO Santiago. We'll listen to you very attentively, Mr. Alejandro Vera. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias por la introducción.
Thank you for that introduction. Thanks to everyone who's joining this transmission. It is a pleasure for me to be here in this event that we've been waiting for so long. We've been after this report for so long also. If you could share my presentation just on the slide that Daniela left it would be great. Thank you. As Daniela was stating, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to share the balance of this publication regarding the trends that have been lived in education within the framework, of course, of the Agenda 2030, of Education 2030, and the SDGs. Now, the report is already available for its download, and you can see there a set of chapters where a thorough analysis of the indicators for each dimension and topics of education is performed. Now, what I want to leave you with in this brief presentation are with the main trends that we've analyzed in this report. We've identified 5 trends. 2 of them are more positive in the sense that they go along with the objectives, the goals that have been stated for 2030. They're on the right track. The previous slide, please. And the other trends are signs of maybe warning for us to put more attention to and then straighten the path towards the goals. Now, the first of the trends, the first of the positive trends is related to the topic that gathers us today, the International Day of Literacy. And why am I saying this? Because the first trend is related to the growth, historical growth of the level of education in our region. This is not from the past few years, not from the past decade, but from a while ago, a sustained growth for the population in literacy. Now we can see these two indicators, and the rate of literacy of the entire population and also the elderly population, or the maximum educational level that's achieved by the population, primary, secondary education, higher education. You can see that in the past 2 decades, that's what this report analyzes. This shows a sustained growth that comes from previous decades in the structural dynamics of our educational system, where our population is reaching higher and higher levels of education. Now, the second trend that I will talk to you about is also a positive one, in the lines that there's growth from some indicators, but this is more recent growth. This is related to the past 20 years and the recent times, where there are indicators that have started to show a positive evolution. What are we referring to? We have 2 examples. First, about the access and coverage of those educational levels that are on the edges of mandatory education for our region. Primary, secondary have been growing for some time now, but the early childhood education and higher education have seen particular growth in the past 20 years. Here we see an example of the rate of enrollment for early childhood education. This is between 0 and 3 years old. This is very low, but there's growth in the past 20 years. It's virtually doubled between 2006 and 2020 in terms of the access. The other indicator that's, okay, there it is back again. Now, we are seeing the completion rate, how many of our teenagers complete secondary education. This is not only important that they access, but also complete this level. Secondary is considered mandatory in most of the countries in the region. Now we see that in the past 20 years, this has seen also rise 15 percentage points, and that's what is reflected on the graph. Next one, please. Here we have other good news, more good news. This is accompanied by close on in the gaps. There's been a 60% of growth in completion, right? But when we see the distribution per types of population, we see a separation between the rural and urban areas, or by income. And in this past 2 decades, those gaps have been closing. They haven't disappeared. This is a matter in which we'll continue to work. We need to continue working on, but there's been a reduction. Now, those first 2 trends that we were discussing are related to a positive evolution of some indicators that we've observed during the balance conducted. Now, on the next slide, we can start discussing the third trend, where some signs of warning appear. What are we observing? There are some indicators where one might start to witness the deceleration. Now they continue growing, but they seem to have reached a plateau, a stabilization. There are 2 typical basic indicators: the enrollment rates and the different levels. We see on the left graph the first line, in blue the primary, red secondary, low secondary, and higher secondary. Now, what you can see there, since 2015 onwards, this is the period where the 2030 agenda was applied, and we see maybe a deceleration in comparison to the previous years. That is far from the levels of universality. Now we see levels around 75 and 80%, and that's been happening for a few years now. This is not only in terms of coverage. There are other indicators about the completion where we can observe the same deceleration. Now, notice what happened between 2000 and year 2015 when the growth was sustained, and there's an important slowdown or a decline. So they don't stop growing, but they're showing us a certain level of deceleration. This is the third trend that was observed. Now, let us move to the fourth one. Next one, please. It is probably one of the major signs warning. There's stagnation that can be observed. When we observe the percentage of students that reach the minimum competences of learning, in this case for primary education, we see that the past 10 years, virtually, there haven't been any modifications, any adjustments in their learning. This is from the Latin American Institute of Assessment of the Education Quality. And this is something that UNESCO Santiago and L'Oreal has seen in the report, in the fourth study. When it was compared to the previous one from 2013, we see that virtually all the different subjects and degree levels that were assessed, there's stagnation, there's a standstill situation in the numbers. So when we look at similar data, but for secondary education, in this case, the test that we are showing is PISA test, where 10 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean participate. Show this between 2015 and 2018, the last two PISA tests show that learning has not changed. We observe there a concerning stagnation of these indicators, as it is happening also in other dimensions. The fifth trend, next slide please, is a trend that assesses one level in particular, which is higher education level or tertiary education. What is happening here, and why is it marked as a different trend than the rest? Because despite we have seen important growth, as it was stated before, was happening with primary education as well, you can see that in the past 20 years, it's virtually tripled in the enrollment numbers. From 2000, we have seen 29 million students in 2020. This is important. Latin America and the Caribbean regions are a part of the worldwide movement. But what is happening? That growth has been aligned with an increase as other indicators are closing gaps, the gaps are growing here, the gaps are expanding. When one looks dimensions such as the income, we see that the gap between the low income and the high income students is broader. Something similar is happening between genders, men and women. There are plenty of dimensions to analyze, of course, but these numbers are showing that. That is why we have marked this as a fifth trend. And just to end this segment of the presentation, we'll mention something about the funding of education. Next slide, please. This is an overarching dimension because obviously educational budget is a reflection of the policy. And we see here a very particular situation in our region. These are the two classical indicators that are used to analyze funding. The expression of public funding, public expenditure in relation to the GDP or the total public expenditure. We see certain stability in the past 20 years in the first graph and certain cycles that are shown on the second graph. But what's important to note is that since 2015, the year where the Agenda 2030 begins, both indicators scale up. Now, the education investment in our region started to decrease precisely when this agenda took place. Now, Daniela has explained the economic and social context that might explain this situation, but factually speaking, there has been less injection of resources in education, and that is a sign that must concern us. This is how far we go with the educational balance report, and I will give the floor now to my colleague Italo for him to explain the challenges brought up to by this scenario.
Doesn't muted.
No se escucha.
Bien, estamos de vuelta entonces ya con el audio.
We are back with audio now. We've solved our technical issues. We thank Alejandro Vera's participation for such revealing facts also about the indicators. Now it's a turn for Italo Dutra, who's the regional counselor for UNICEF Lacro, and he will be giving us the end of this presentation. Let me remind you, Italo, to unmute your microphone, turn your camera on, and we are listening to you. Thank you so much, Fran. Hopefully you can hear me. It is a pleasure for me to contribute to this presentation. I just wanted to ask you to please put the screen with the slides on. Thank you. I'll tell you about the challenges of the educational policies in the region. In this scenario of the report with the SDGs, particularly number 4, I would like to first give you an overview and maybe touch on what Daniela and Alejandro discussed. We observed, and this is the data that are addressing up to 2020 in most cases. That is important to mention. That we had seen deceleration with a set of indicators that were improving, but ones with more, maybe at a higher speed, and others not so much. Stabilization, maybe of some, but with the events of 2020 and the pandemic that hit afterwards, and then as Daniela stated, with the crisis of the Ukraine war and everything that entails in terms of like the stagnation of the economies in the most fragile countries of our region, we first see that we need data. We need to move along with the reports, such as this one. In the future, we'll have data about the reporting of countries, and the few reports of the region that we have now show a very concerning trend of a downturn and in the levels of learning, something that, of course, makes us take a step back. And as Claudia mentioned and Rada mentioned, there's joint and investment that is needed urgently for improvement. In the presentation, of course, the first challenge is not only acknowledging, recognizing education as a human right, but also the realization of that right is something that must be coordinated among the member states, governments, societies, and families. This is a combination and an obligation of everyone to recognize the realization of this right. A very key trend is that the educational sector is not separated from others. There's intersectoral coordination that is fundamental with policies of social protection that must walk together with the educational policies. Health policies must also go aligned, and protection against violence, and all of the different sectors that are meant to work together towards the realization of the education as a human right. Now, in order to improve and move forward or revert the trend that seems to be happening after the pandemic, is important work involving intersectoral coordination. Another matter that we are all repeating in different fora, and we'll hear more from Leonardo afterwards, on the transformative summit that will happen, that will take place in 2 weeks from today, is now much needed to have the vision that the right to education is something to focus on, recovering the levels of learning at the time and the educational quality. That is, it is not to say that we've overcome the challenge of access to education. Many children and teenagers are out of school, and we need to think of different possibilities to level that. But the focus, the approach for now is on learning, recovering the levels and quality of learning. It is in that direction that we think it's impossible to have an approach of learning without having a systemic curricular view about this. We cannot continue thinking that the contents are separated in centuries and the lives of children and adolescents and people that have access to tertiary or higher education are so segmented. We need to think of a curricular vision and put it into practice also, not just think about it in a way that it's systemic and based on the different competencies and skills that we know are key for the 21st century world. And of course, we expect to continue moving in that direction. Reconceptualization of education, rethinking education from its founding, the pillars, and giving priority thus to the early childhood development and primary development and all the rest of the stages, such as we have a renewed view of the need to focus on the fundamental needs for language, maths, arts, etc. So there's a process of rethinking education and, of course, changing the system in education, not only based on the curricular vision, but also based on the methodologies and all of the work that must be conducted with the professional assessment. And then we move to the next slide, which involves, of course, thinking that there's no rethinking education without focusing on the teachers responsible for the work that reaches all children and adolescents and adults that are in the education system. Now, with this economic crisis, there's countries where the wages of the teaching staff is not something dignified. We also need to give them better working conditions, not only with supporting materials for their functions, but also we need to give them the chance to professionally develop with teacher training at the level of society and science development and technology development that are so relevant today for a 21st century citizenship. And in this case, you cannot think that only with formal education or with the different stages of formal education, one can continue with life. We need to consider and focus on learnings that are given throughout life. So it isn't possible to think of education in such a closed view. There's other areas we see the trends. Their enrollment rates are stuck. There's slow enrollment among adolescents with the pandemic that have dropped out of high school. And with the numbers that we saw, there's an important matter with the gaps that are now becoming larger between genders and income. Transformative secondary education is another challenge. It needs to be more accessible for the needs of the youth. That is something absolutely fundamental. And of course, among all of these challenges and discussion, we cannot move forward in educational funding. We see that the trends and investment are low with the lack of data or the limited data. We still see that it's getting worse. Educational funding is needed because we have a historical gap that needs to be closed. There are sectors that still don't have access to education. There's parts of the population that are constantly being affected by any change, by any pressures put into the educational system, indigenous communities in a region, Afro-descendant populations historically segregated and that need higher investment in terms of infrastructure, quality, and access. But when we speak of educational funding, we also need a more efficient and effective management of the education investment, and now the administrative and strategic competences of the people conducting the management of the investment is absolutely key. Now, as you can see there is a scenario that's very clear. Before the pandemic, of course, the joint effort of these three agencies is shown. And I am truly excited to be here because there is an interagency effort that is huge, and we need to complement the work that we are performing under each mandate of our agencies. And this report is something that makes me joyful, and I'm honored to see that this came out of based on a joint effort of the three agencies. We need further studies, producing evidence to make decisions in the different sectors, and more particularly in the different sectors that are responsible for education in countries, the central sector, but there are other countries where an important role is played at a subnational level. Now, with that, I thank you for the invitation to this event, to be able to share this data. I'm truly happy to be in such good company right now. Thank you. Thank you, Italo, for those inspiring words. Many thanks. I remind you that Italo Dutra is Regional Counselor of Education at UNICEF Lagro. I would like to thank Alejandro Vera, head of the Monitoring and Planning section with Ureal UNESCO in Santiago, Chile, and Daniela Truco, higher official of official matters at ECLAC. Now, we are finalizing now with the regional report of the SDG4 Education in 2030 Agenda, the Education in Latin America and the Caribbean at a Crossroads report. And now we'll leave you with specialists that know in detail the reality of education in this region. Now it is the turn for the head of division of education of the Inter-American Development Bank, Mercedes Mateo. Welcome, Mercedes. We are listening to you now. Please put your camera on and unmute your microphone. Thank you so much, and many thanks to UNESCO, ECLAC, and UNICEF for the opportunity to be here today, surrounded by such noteworthy people. Congratulations on that report. It is extremely pertinent indeed. As the report tells us, 7 years after the approval of the 2030 Agenda and facing the challenges that have been more acute by the pandemic, the balance that we see is indeed challenging. The main headlines of the compliance with the SDGs are
las áreas más demoradas, sistemáticamente encuentra la educación, el ODS 4.
And that is, of course, pertinent to education. 70% of companies in Latin America and the Caribbean are within the process of digitally transformed. And it is expected that the demand for professionals of technologies of information is multiplied by 2030, precisely the year where the 2030 Agenda finalizes and when we should have reached the development goals. This is our reality. And now we won't be reaching SDG4, but the world continues to move at a very radical pace. And the problem bottom line is that this time there's no turning back. The inequality gaps, let us not forget that we are one of the regions, as the study reminded us of, that is most unequal in the world, will continue to grow in generations that are absolutely disconnected. Now, the question that I ask myself constantly, and I think many of us do this as well, is that do we really care about education? We know that education is a key component of any recipe for creating mobility, social mobility, and possibilities of success for families. But now we're going to do something. The what would be for me the key point of the conversation right now is how ambitious are we going to be in what we are proposing. In the past decades, as the study showed, the region has made progress in terms of increasing coverage, but not in quality nor pertinence of the learnings and equity in education, at least not enough. To continue with our reality, now 70% of the companies in the region say that they find a severe gap in skills, and this is not going to get better. This is not only about equity, but unity. Not reaching SDG number 4 is to destroy the social tissue and citizens tissue if we do not develop our human capital and our talent, not only individually, but regionally, will be disconnected from the global social process. And now, where do we invest? That is the question. What do we prioritize? That is why it is key to go back to what Alejandra and Daniela and Italo were stating. Prior to the pandemic, we knew that we had inequality. 50% of the students of 15 years old did not understand what they were reading. When you don't understand what you're reading, you cannot read to learn. And of course, you cannot develop your critical thinking or unite all of the fragments of information that you're receiving. They did not have basic mathematics skills. It's hard if you don't have the basic math skills to develop computing thinking. Less than 20% of those who finished high school did not have the necessary competences for life or for work. From the digital perspective, systems were not ready to move towards an emergency remote system of education. What happened with the pandemic? So far, over 30 studies have been published seeking to measure the impact of the schools closing. 32 out of 35 worldwide find evidences of learning losses. Latin America and the Caribbean is the region that reflects highest learning losses. We have evidences from Brazil and Mexico, among others. We are speaking of losses that are documented between 1 and 5.3 standard deviation. The household surveys of 2020 show 3.5 million additional children and youth that have been left out of schools, and we'll have 2.5 years of schooling lost. Few children had interaction with teachers, and the low number of hours dedicated to studies and the losses in learning made the possibility of dropout in students up to 27 years old increases in almost 30%. 6 out of 10 students suffer cyberbullying in a virtual education system, particularly women, saw an increase of 26 percentage point in anxiety symptoms regarding their male partners. And now the increase in the levels of anxiety is, of course, related to low performance, particularly in math. Therefore, we have heard of it also, that the schools closing will have impact in the economic or the income of these generations, and also the regional economy as a result of the losses of learning if we do nothing about it. Now, on the verge of the opening of the Transformative Education Summit, we have Leonardo here, who's precisely orchestrating this global movement. We have to wonder, what is the agenda that will be pushing forward? To me, we have 4 key policies. The first one is about connectivity and digitalization of education. The tech sector is one of the least developed ones in health, let's say. Never before the pandemic, connectivity had been so important for the continuity not only of the school or work, but the life in general. Now, the disconnection in the pandemic was not equal for everyone. Never before connectivity up to today had marked the difference between the poor and the wealthy in remote and urban areas. When the economic activity and social activity starts to depend of bandwidth, access starts to become a right, not just an alternative. I will skip the data of educational connectivity and the quality of school education and the big gaps that we have, but also the gaps between rural areas and urban areas. But I would like to highlight that connectivity cannot be a luxury anymore. We cannot think of an educational model that will help children that if the service does not include connectivity and access with the digital world. The second main topic and policy that we should prioritize is about the foundational skill development. It is unacceptable in the 21st century that all children or youth do not understand the text when they're reading it, and they cannot manage basic mathematics skills or knowledge. That cannot happen. The third policy is about conditions for learning. Learning does not happen in a void. There's necessary conditions for it to occur. First, you cannot learn when you're hungry. School, food, and now nutrition and are key concepts. The Economist just published an amazing article about the programs of feeding in schools, and now they will need to replace the additional gap if they want them to go back to schools. Among the educational solutions, monetary and non-monetary incentives for schools will be keys for families, and you cannot learn when you are under stress, anxiety, or depression. Mental health and social and emotional development of children and youth and what we call 21st century skills are key and need to be in our focus. Is it enough to then set as a global goal solely that our children and youth know to read and write? Are we not being unambitious? It is very clear that no children or teenager today should leave school without understanding what they're reading or to know key concepts in math. It is also in our knowledge that none of them will have real chances of involving effectively in the social and economic life if they don't have critical thinking, digital skills, the ability to communicate effectively with others, the skills to collaborate and work in teams. These are key skills to develop non-routinary abilities that cannot be replaced by machines. That is also part of our reality shock. Now, of course, we need to extend the schooling and, of course, investment policies or policies to review the financing rules. It is also a pillar that Leonardo will tell us more about. None of what I stated can be done correctly if we do not invest. As the authors of the report reminded us, we need to spend wisely what we have and spend efficiently, but we need to invest more. Our calculations tell us that we need to invest between 1 and 2 points of the regional GDP if we want to recover what was lost in the pandemic and transform the educational system to then close gaps and not having that disconnection anymore between that disconnection. And I would like to say something from Sarah Westover. People cannot always be resilient, but a country can. Countries through educational policies need to be able to higher the levels of learning and education in communities. That inevitably means that they need to focus on solving inequality problems. There cannot be a single educational system today that doesn't have inequality in their core plan. In Finland, for example, they are not just offering the best, but the same educational quality system for everyone. And they ended up among the best in the world. Reaching SDG4 today is increasing social resilience, and to increase that resilience, we need to invest where it's needed the most. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mercedes, Mateo, for that wonderful presentation that clearly tells us how education requires of multiple factors to be conducted effectively and efficiently. Thank you so much. We are paying attention to the advancements that we'll see in education, both in Latin America and in the Caribbean region. We'll continue now with Lorette Bristol. She's the program manager resource from Calicom, and now Lorette will ask you to turn on your camera as we've done with the previous speakers, and we'll also ask you to unmute your microphone so that we can clearly listen to your presentation.
Thank you, everyone,
okay?
and good morning. I trust that you are hearing me clearly. Fantastic. So I just want to take the opportunity first to congratulate UNESCO, ECLAC, and UNICEF for putting together this report. And thank you as well for the opportunity for the CARICOM Secretariat to respond to the findings from the report. I think sometimes it is best to respond from a reflective position. So what this report does is create the opportunity for us within the Caribbean region as a member of Latin America and the Caribbean to reflect on the our progress as well in comparison to our colleagues against the SDG4. The Caribbean community's progress against SDG4 is a matter of economic and social resilience. There are areas of concern as reflected in the report around data accessibility and the capacity needs for data management within our ministries of education to appropriately guide policy dialogue. But significant strides are being made, and we're seeing that in the area with most member states making investments in information systems management. In 2019, the CARICOM Secretariat, with support from the CDB, commissioned the Readiness for Action report for phase 1 of the CARICOM Human Resource Development Strategy 2030. So this conversation today is very timely, as I want to take the opportunity before I get into the meat and flesh of reflecting on the SDG monitoring report to quickly highlight some of our progress against that based upon our own monitoring progress report that we are going to be sharing at the upcoming 44th Council for Human and Social Development Education Ministers meeting, which will take place on the 13th and 14th of October. For CARICOM, our member states for the period of the similar period of reporting in relation to educational levels of the population, we saw regional targets being met and or surpassed by some of our member states. In 2017, the regional net enrollment rate for primary level was 88.7%, with member states setting a regional target of 95% to be achieved by 2030. The average NER for the CARICOM region was 94% in 2018-2019. In 2019-2020 academic year to 88.1%, and for the academic year 2020-2021, 85.8%. The regional NER then was 2.99% points below the 2017 benchmark and 9.2% percentage points below the proposed CARICOM regional target for the indicator. Countries at or above the regional target of 95% for 2021 were Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis, and St. Lucia. There were notable increases as well in the secondary level of access and participation indicators, and these are a result, no doubt, of sustained efforts by member states to address the needs of the secondary education sector and foster inclusion of all students throughout the cycle. We did see, however, net enrollment rates and survival rates at the primary level declining marginally for the academic years 2017-18 and to 2020-21. Although these two indicators recorded values of more than 80% every year from 2019 to 2020, they are, however, trending away from our regional targets, and attention is being given to redressing primary survival and completion rates as this risk to gains being made in the secondary education downstream. While significant strides are being made by member states to increase access and participation in early childhood education between 2018 and 19, the enrollment levels fell drastically in the succeeding years. For the Caribbean, 2020 brought two new emergencies: the COVID-19 pandemic, which continued into 2021, and the eruption of the Lassifré volcano for St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2021, with ashfall affecting neighboring countries, and for SVG in particular, shifting schools into emergency shelters and further displacing learning time and challenging participation in regional assessments. The proportion of children in grades 2 3, achieving at least minimum proficiency level in reading has increased steadily in the region, exceeding the regional target of 75%. And we do see performance in mathematics for the same period decreasing by 4.2% during the same period. What is important, though, in terms of recognizing some of the key lessons as we celebrate, I think as it relates to this regional report being shared by our colleagues in UNESCO, etc., and without trying to repeat what was already said, critically, we recognize that there is a need to better understand the conditions for educational success at all levels of the delivery system. So we need to understand those responsibilities at the level of the government, at the level of the Ministry of Education, at the level of the school, and at the level of the family and the community. We also need to protect not just growth in access, but also growth in participation. And sometimes we talk about access, but we don't talk about participation. So if we want to benefit from the fullness of education, we need to protect growth and participation as well, because we're seeing more and more persons accessing, because we are almost at the point of universal access to basic education in the region. But we also have to protect not just learning outcomes for success, but we also have to protect survival in education for primary and secondary education as well. And this is critical for the social and civic well-being of the region for Latin America and the Caribbean. Critically as well, what the lesson from the report indicates that we need to reconceive partnerships at all levels. Therefore, we need to rethink the ways in which we create inclusive cultures in schools and create more open systems, and therefore make more collaborative room for the inclusion of parents in the educational enterprise. And importantly, when we talk about data and the importance of data, it is also critical to track this kind of data as well. So importantly, we must track the quantitative data, but that qualitative data about how we go about creating cultures of inclusion within schools is absolutely critical. Those best practices that are emerging in different sectors. And it's a question then of how do we scale that up so we do not have those practices occurring in ad hoc realities. There's also a need for intersectional cooperation being more than what it is understood now, because intersectional cooperation cannot just occur without governance for interoperability. And this requires, therefore, new leadership and the transformation of the public and civil service, which the management of educational delivery lives within. This is absolutely critical for the agility and the resilience of our education system. Reimagining education, therefore, requires the reconceptualization of governance for lifelong learning and the critical role of the foundation years as a part of that project. So while we celebrate the gains that we have experienced, despite the exogenous challenges of ensuring and securing quality lifelong learning for all, the Caribbean community is also cognizant of the fact that there are significant urgencies around educational governance, strategic education financing, and the need to reimagine, as I said before, the sustainable, equitable intergenerational mobility and access to employability skills for revenue generation. As such, the region, through its coordinated efforts of the CARICOM Secretariat, will also be seeking to implement regional public goods that will reduce education financing wastages and inefficiencies and accelerate access and participation, equity, relevance, and quality in the areas of educational delivery, where these are stagnated or marginalized while maintaining the gains achieved for effective innovations. Some of those highlight initiatives, I think it's important for us to share as well. For example, when we talk about protecting gains around access and participation, but also understanding more deeply the kinds of conditions that are needed for learning for success. The CDB CARICOM OECS Learning Recovery and Enhancement Program for Caribbean Schools, the Caribbean New School Model, the Basic Education Quality Management Framework, and of course, our guidelines for establishing teaching councils, recognizing the importance of teachers in the project for transformation of education. The transforming education then is an agenda that is not for the weak of heart. We talk about it, and my colleague Mercedes talked about whether or not we really want to transform education. It is an agenda for the mindfully committed. It is disruptive, and it is particularly disruptive to the status quo. It positions a new reformation of a social, political, and economic contract between us, the present, and the future. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, entonces.
Thank you very much. We were here with the presentation of Lorette Bristol. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. And I'd like to remind you that this event is being broadcasted simultaneously into English, and you may look for the link in the description of the event. And it is now turn off. It is my honor to introduce Leonardo Rodriguez, the Special Advisor, the Secretary General of the UN for the Summit on Transformation of Education. He is the one responsible to close this Q&A session. Please, we are going to unmute yourself and keep your screen on. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Stephanie, not only for their report, but for working jointly on this educational topic, which is something that's very important. Just like governments, we need everyone to work jointly in the educational matters. Data is hard. The pandemic has had a brutal impact, shocking. But as the report shows, the issues, the evidence by the report, they're fine, right? The need to face these tragedies is nothing new, right? So the great question is why, if we have spoken about this so many times, why haven't we been able to solve this, right? There are great educational challenges, the challenge of access, quality, the learning, and the relevance in the changing world we're living in. And of course, because we have the social processes, there's no just one explanation, right? It's different emergent processes interact to generate advances, because certainly there has been progress, but also to limit the impact or the extent of that progress. I'd like to highlight some of those issues, those challenges, as per what we discussed within the context of the Summit for the Transformation in Education, and later try to repeat what we've mentioned, right? And some things I agree with. If we think about the demands of students, we need to recognize the impact of intergenerational reproduction, not only of poverty, but of educational poverty. The sons and daughters of the most rural, the poorest, the most discriminated families who have much more difficulties to access education, and to learn that those that come from medium high families, highly educated, Mercedes already mentioned this, we can't learn well with hunger or under the conditions that these children. But that is serious, because from terms of the supply, we do have an unequal supply that, in paradox, offers less to those that need more. The challenge is how to correct the elements of the educational system, but not only exclusion in terms of access, but supply of inequality, right, that purposely affect those that need resources for learning. That's not an exclusion of education, it's an exclusion of the learning. As Italo very well said, we have to talk about the transformation of Latin America. We've been experts. There's many speeches on curricular reform, right? But I believe that in this discussion, we're using two issues. We've seen this in the discussions of the summit. One has to do with an absurd debate. If what we need is an education, a fundamental reading, writing, and calculation-based learning, or if we need a deep education that trains global citizens, critical citizens, committed to development, to live life, and to coexist, right? The answer should be obvious. We need an education that does both things, right? It's debate into theology, and it sort of paralyzes at the end. We clearly wanted that deep, comprehensive education. We must understand that despite the fact we could have basic education without deep into interpersonal development, the other way, it's not certain the way around. It's not possible to support something that forms or trains critical citizens without basic, or without the support of foundation-based education, right? As Mercedes says, we can't be left without basics, but we cannot just stay with the basic, right? And the foundations. We should behind that absurd debate. I wanted to add another dilemma here. Many times this is hidden, but I believe it is a thread of a latent debate throughout the history of Latin American education. It is that in addition to this debate between what is deep and what is basic for the foundation, I believe that the conflict that has always been there in our educational system, the conflict between those that see the education as training in obedience, and here we have the stereotype of the student, exemplary student, right? The slogan, which is quite terrible, which is the letters with blood they enter. It's terrible. We have the vision of education, as Freire mentioned, as a practical education of the free will, right? Like I said, it's a free exercise of will. The old dilemma brings conservatives and liberals that follow our educational system, and you can see the debates there, and you can see how this tends to generate ruptures between those two visions. Yet again, I believe that the liberal view needs the basic learning, but it doesn't offer them with an authoritative regime, but based on a critical debate that stimulates not only loving to learn, but need to learn about the need of the discipline and effort required, right? And I want to link this to the type of teacher that is able to lead these transformations we're talking about. Teachers are undervalued, underpaid, and those are three gaps that need to be solved. In addition to those issues, something that we not always mention, which is there's teachers that have to go from vertical authoritative education to an education that builds people that are autonomous, not only requires different training, but a cultural change. Why? Because this educational transformation generates a great fear to teachers and teach on social media, on the loss of authority. Teachers feels like this nowadays does not respect, does not obey. They don't see them as an authority. But we need to understand that the challenge here is authority. We define the source of the individual that teaches with technological and digital revolution. Never come again. More information that the students or mature that answers that are predefined by the teacher. The new authority of a teacher has to be able to turn to a guideline for learning. This is a difficult thing. How we understand power relationships, right, in the past. And this transformation, by this, clearly related with the topic digital revolution. There's something, there's a true paradox. Not significant education, the pandemic leads. That is the acknowledgement that it could have, right, in education, but also, and I will not just the challenge of connectivity. We do not have connectivity. We have for 60 to 70% of students out, right? opportunity, but not equity. We have resources that are under goods and open for all the students and all. This leads us to the next topic mention, which is like educational transformation and the funding of education. We need to invest more, to invest in a more equitable and in a more efficient manner. The three things. When you look at the amounts that we invest per student in the countries, they're not enough. When you look at how this is distributed between what is urban, what is rural, the medium income sectors, we are not investing adequately, and we have a large quantity of inefficiency. I'd like to close with talking about investing more because we're not time deadline or limit here. I think that the presence of ECLEC is really important here, and we need to understand that there's an enormous relationship between how much we want to invest in education, how willing we are to transform the tax system to transform education, the type of development that we have. If countries bet to have, as Arthur Lewis said, a supply that is almost limited of cheap labor, we will be in a poverty trap. The profitability of the economy will not depend on the growing productivity or the of workers, but if they're low cost. And I'd summarize that by saying that the possibility of transforming education is not only an element that contributes to escape the trap of poverty, but to be able to transform and fund education. That will depend on the fact that we make necessary decisions to exit these poverty traps. From educational funding, financing has to start being an investment action. And that means not only educational transformation, but it means a transformation of the development chain of our countries. Thank you. Thank you very much, Leonardo Gamier, for your presentation where you ended on the global perspective of education. Thank you very much. I'd like to remind you that Leonardo is a special advisor to the Secretary General of the UN for the Summit on the Transformation of Education. I'd like to thank Lorette Bristol again for her presentation. She is from Program Manager Human Resource Development in CARICOM, and Nicolas Mateo, head of the Education Division of the IDB. And we are almost concluding here our interesting meeting and encounter. Now, for the closing words, we'll have Bantercine Mendez, who's the head of education, Boreal UNESCO Santiago. How are you? Walter here. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to close this event along a publication that is so significant in Latin America and for the Caribbean. On a day that is very important too, right? As many of you know, today is the International Day of Lectures, right? That we are reading and writing, which we celebrate for more than 5 years, right? Literacy. And today with this event, we would like to send an invitation to support that monitoring of the SDG4 within the goals that brings literacy as a factor for dignity and the right to education. Among the data, the report today shows, we can see that around 28 million adults and the youth more than 15 years of age are illiterate in our region. Most of them are in rural areas, as we've heard, right? That challenge we heard from Mr. Leonardo Garnier. And many of them are in the environments of extreme vulnerability. We, in addition, as we've seen in different interventions today, we have this economic crisis and the effects of the pandemic, which are impacting the de-acceleration and stagnation of pregnancy, and hampering the advance of educational achievements we've had in last years. Seeing that those goals, SDG4, the countries have committed to, especially in 2015, will deeply threatened. Goals will not be complied with if we don't modify policies and the assignment of resources for education. For example, if we analyze the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, the report shows a scenario with a great potential to progress towards a universal supply of care for early childhood that is equitable. And nevertheless, when we look at the detail of the report, that beyond these advanced progress seen and the first two trends shown by the report, where, for example, we're going to highlight the positive aspects of the evolution of some indicators, we can also see that that is still not much of a percentage of the population that really accesses to the early childhood development programs. It's only 18.6% of those children between 0 and 2 years of age. Now, we therefore have to accelerate the pace, because if we keep this growth pace, we see that by 2030 we would reach 1/4 of the population. The third trend that's revealed that presented the powers of this report can evidence the deacceleration of secondary education in general. And the fourth we've seen brings an indicator which is quite concerning for the rate. There's stagnant access to primary and secondary education. The fifth trend shows this increase of certain gaps, specific gaps in the tertiary education level, showing that the significant expansion that we've all reached in the last years is quite unequal in the region between the stakeholders of society. Now, quite concerningly, we see that there's 15 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that have started to reduce their public investment in education since 2015. Therefore, in the face of these challenging, of all these challenges or challenging elements, it is increasingly more important to increase investment in the monitoring of SDG4. Our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, has an assessment framework that is actively constructive with the regional identity in it. 25 years in monitoring, capacity building, and South-South cooperation. And the Latin American Laboratory for the Assessment of the Quality of Education, the IEFE, is here in UNESCO, right? And its study, for example, regional comparative study, benchmark LEFI, is one of the official mechanisms of monitoring of SDG4 of the 2030 Agenda in our region, whose data we've been collected in part of the report that we present today. Therefore, we'd like to invite all the organizations present today, everyone that is accompanying us online in this event, to renew your commitment with that laboratory and with the UNESCO monitoring efforts and the UN agency entities. From UNESCO, we will continue progressing on the search of the support of the countries for the data culture, this culture of policies, evidence-based policies through different action. As the IEFE I just mentioned as an action, also driving the regional board of SDG4, whose secretariat is here in UNESCO, OREALC. For example, the conclusions of this regional report have been part of the third regional meeting of ministers of education of Latin America and the Caribbean, and all this input is already part of the creation. They're part of the creation of the Declaration of Buenos Aires a couple of weeks ago, right? And that commitment, the highest educational authorities of the region acknowledged the challenges presented today and to progress towards the SDG4, the goals, and they also assumed the need of driving a profound transformation that covers the structural and addresses the systemic issues that have contributed to the debt and to that educational injustice tracked by our region. In addition, within the framework of the UN organizations, we are working jointly for the summit on the transformation in education. And this new report, we believe, is key for the summit of heads of state, right? That we heard about the words from Mr. Daniel. To conclude, all our colleagues from the organizations, the system of the UNICEF, CEPAL, ECLAC, and UNESCO for making this report. In turn, thank you to our professionals and our team. And thanks to the work of our team, we've reaped the benefits of other institutions, the International Institute of UNESCO for Higher Education, Latin America and the Caribbean, the IFTOC, and a group, an enormous set of different specialists who have participated in the creation of this report with their experience and their knowledge. So thank you very much, everyone. I'd also like to thank all the panel members today, IPAC, UNICEF, and the words of Mercedes Mateo, Lorette Bristol, and Leonardo Arnier, friends of mine. Thank you very much for supporting us, support us in specific actions and activities to improve the measurement, the use, and the dissemination of the score indicators. It is now time. It is time to recover the lessons learned and to reimagine and transform the educational systems to revitalize the national and regional efforts to reach the SDG4 goals. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Val, for your words. And would like to thank the presence and the interesting intervention of speakers. And I'd like to thank all the attendees here of the launch here of the report SDG4 of the UN. Crossroads of education in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd like to remind you, and this is great news, that this publication is already available for you to download, and you may access the website here. The report will also find related material that is related to this launch in Spanish. The site is s.unesco.org/Informe Educación 2030, and in English, the website is nen.unesco.org/Education 2030 report. I'd like to yet again thank all the attendees. Thank you very much for your participation today, for being here with us, for being part of this broadcast. It's so necessary in these moments we're currently living on, right? So